Welcome again to our journey of what I learned about faith from the Indian people that we had the privilege of being with for 8 years. Again, I want to say that this series of explorations is not shared to describe what the Indians believe or practice, rather, it's what I learned from living with them. This week's journey begins with a story. My first meeting with the Indian pastors. We gathered at the site of one of the church buildings in rural Oklahoma. I arrived early and visited with people, and quite a few of the pastors had arrived, and they were huddled around three different cars. Obviously, the cars were, in their terms, baling wire Buicks, shimmering Chevys, or affordable Fords. The Indian pastors were poor, their salaries were low. And one of the ways they supported each other was when they would have a meeting, sometimes they would tow another car in and they would work on the cars. And they were huddled around these three different cars, and they went into town to the auto parts store and got the parts they thought. And one by one, those cars started up. And every time anybody was on the church grounds sitting underneath the trees, everybody cheered as the car got started. Then the meeting started. Grease on their clothes didn't make any difference. What astounded me was during this time, no one was pacing, no one was annoyed. Everybody knew those cars need to be fixed. Now, I just moved from Dallas, a far different culture than that, where when you got people together, it always seemed like there was something more important or a place more important that they should have been than where they were. Always anticipating being to the next place. And then I experienced the Indian community that was just the opposite. You see, in the community that I just come from, to be patient, to wait, and just to be present without accomplishing anything was a burden that you had to carry. But not so for the Indian community. It wasn't a burden just to be present without accomplishing anything. It wasn't a burden to wait. It, it wasn't a burden to be patient because the needs of another was being met. For the first time, I was experiencing the lifestyle that one exists for the sake of everyone in the community. I'd always experienced the lifestyle that the community existed for the sake of the individual, and all of a sudden I was a part of the community that the individual existed for the sake of the group. Oh, what a difference. I lived with this experience and became increasingly aware of the power of the tribe, the power of the clan, and in the journey of faith, the power of Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference. For what was best for Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference was more important than what was best for any individual. What was best for each other was more important than what was best for me. Now I want to fast forward to 9/11. A couple weeks after 9/11, I received a call from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency of the federal government. They told me that the Mohawk Indian tribe had agreed to come down and cut the steel that was collapsed in the pit where the building was, because the steel welders in the Mohawk tribe knew how their fathers and their uncles had built the building. They were skilled, and they were the ones that were needed to cut the steel of the collapsed structure. FEMA explained to me that the problem was that FEMA and other helping agencies would come every morning where the Mohawk Indians would go down into the pit to work all day, and the Mohawk Indians walked by them without saying a word. And they were trying to offer help, but they couldn't even enter into conversation with the Indian people that were doing their job. And FEMA knew about Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference because of the tremendous leadership that the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference had given FEMA and other agencies after the bombing of the Murrah building in 1995 in Oklahoma City. They said, "Bishop, can you be of help?" Well, the next day, 6 Indians from Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, men and women, lay and clergy, got on a plane to fly to New York City. One of the women had never flown, never wanted to fly, was committed to never flying because she was scared to death of that experience. She got on the plane. A layperson informed his boss that he had volunteered to go to do this to be of help in New York City. When he returned 3 weeks later, he realized that he had been fired. He lost his job because he wanted to help and care. Well, they went to the sidewalk where the Mohawk Indians walked in every morning, and they sat there. And when the Mohawk Indians came up at noon for a water break, they were there. Mohawk Indians walked by as if they weren't there. This continued for several days, but the team from Oklahoma sat and stood and waited there every morning, every noon, and every evening, slept ready for the next day of presence, of waiting, of patience. After several days, the Mohawk Indian workers came out and greeted the Indians from Oklahoma. They visited with each other, they shared with each other, they became lifelong friends, morning, noon, and evening. FEMA was shocked. They said, "How? Why did it happen?" I knew. The agency people were there in the morning to, quote, do their job and see if the Indians needed anything. But they weren't present. They weren't willing to wait. They didn't have patience. And they were not there at noon. And they were not there in the evening. Well, there's a lot more to the story. But you see, the Indian people went from Oklahoma to New York City, and their presence and their patience and their waiting was the gift that they were willing to offer rather than a burden that they had to bear. How often in life I waited. How often my presence was all I could offer and I felt so inadequate. How often had my patience run out because others would not respond? But from that time on, in my journey of faith, I realized that in everyday living or in times of crisis, my presence is more important than my words. My waiting for another to respond is my gift, not a burden to bear. And as God, through others, has patience with me, so am I to give the gift of my patience to others. Simply stated, what I learned from the Indian community of faith is that everyday living, like fixing the baling wire Buick or the affordable Fords or the shimmering Chevys, the everyday of life, presence, my waiting, my patience is a gift I have to offer. Or if it be in a time of crisis, of death or trauma, I've got to be patient. I've got to be willing to wait. I've got to be willing to offer my presence without, quote, accomplishing anything. You see, what I learned from the Indians about faith was that it involves patience. It involves waiting. Yeah, it involves simple presence. And all of those are not a burden to bear, but a gift to share. I hope you enjoyed thinking about these two stories in my journey. And for your thought and our conversation, let me leave you with 3 questions. First of all, what are your experiences of receiving the gifts of another's presence being all that was needed in a time of crisis? Secondly, when we consider waiting on another a burden to bear, what happens in that relationship? And finally, what experiences have you had when the patience of another made a significant difference in your life? Enjoy the journey. Thank you.